Hello, my name is Lenore Harris, and I'd like to welcome you to Writers on Writing at West Valley College. And our guest author today is Cristina García. She is the author of 5 novels: Dreaming in Cuban, The Agüero Sisters, Monkey Hunting, A Handbook to Luck, The Lady Matador's Hotel. She is also the editor of 2 anthologies, a nominee of the National Book Award, a recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship, the Whiting Writers Award, a Hodder Fellowship, and an NEA grant, among others. In addition to her writing, she has also written a book of poetry called The Lesser Tragedy of Death, and she has a new book, which will be coming out in 2013, called The King of Cuba. And we are very excited to have her with us today. Along with myself, I am accompanied by additional creative writing faculty here at West Valley College and one of our creative writing students. And I'd like for them to introduce themselves.
My name is Katya, and I'm the student of creative writing.
You want to tell them a little bit about your writing?
Well, I enjoy writing a lot of fiction, and not so good with poetry, but
she's a wonderful writer. She is, and a wonderful assistant in my class. Thank you.
I'm Paulette Boudreau, and I am also on the West Valley College faculty, and I'm a novelist myself, a fiction writer also.
And I'm Susan Glass. I'm also on the writing faculty at West Valley College, and I'm a poet mostly, and kind of twine that in with music a bit.
All right. So we're going to start first by talking a little bit about writing process. I think that this would be useful to our students who are going to be watching, both our composition students as well as our creative writing students. So we were wondering, what is your writing routine, and do you have a ritual that kind of help you get into the mood, so to speak?
yes, thank you. Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. It's a great pleasure. I feel like I'm sitting with the dream team. So much appreciated. I do have writing rituals and routines. Of course, there's the perfect day, and then there's what usually happens. So theoretically, the perfect day is a day where I have about 6 uninterrupted hours to work. And in that perfect day, I will spend the first hour or 2 pretty much warming up with language, almost doing language exercises basically by reading poetry. And what that does for me is it derails me from the quotidian, it derails me from kind of logical progression type thinking, and gets me thinking more in phrases and imagistically and sensorially, and usually in the course of that hour or 2 of reading and then copying things down and just being in conversation with poets, something in that day will invariably, I've been doing this for 20 years, invariably will get some traction, some unexpected thing will happen, and then I'll know where to start that day, where to continue. I do this religiously, writing the first draft of anything, and I'm just starting a new book now, so I'm doing this, every writing day I do this. And I would say that, and then I sometimes have candles around, those 9-day votive candles to the Virgin of Guadalupe, whoever I think could help. Virgin of Guadalupe, sometimes it's, Santa Barbara, who's conflated with Chango and Cuban Santeria. Sometimes it's La Virgen de la Caridad del Cobre, who is the patron saint of Cuba. And I just somehow love having the accompaniment of that flame, of just that candle. And that's pretty much how it works. And when things are going well, I have 4 or 5 days a week like that. And when I'm in full teaching mode, as you all know, I'm sure, it's somewhat less.
Yes. Yeah. All right. And I think that's, how do you pick your poems? I mean, how do you pick the poems that you're going to read for any given month, on any given day?
There comes a point, I'm I'm teaching in Texas right now, but my home base is New Mexico, so all my poetry books are there. But usually I have a wall of poetry from which I can kind of pick and choose. And I've just learned over the years just to intuitively, I kind of know who I need to be in conversation with. Right now I'm writing a book that's partly set in Chile. And so I'm reading quite a bit of Enrique Lin, Lihn, who is... Pablo Neruda gets kind of all the airtime in, or Nicanor Parra, but Enrique Lin is just a fantastic poet. So I'm reading a lot of him right now. And then novellas by Bolaño. And the combination of those two are really fueling the work. So sometimes it's important to have a sense of with whom you need to be in dialogue with. And that's more intuitive than anything else.
How many projects will you work on simultaneously? Do you like to find one project in particular and just really devote your energy to that? Or do you find that, like the poetry, each day you work back and forth among creative endeavors?
Yeah. I generally work, I'm kind of sequentially monogamous that way. I probably across the board. So it's very hard for me in the course of 1 week to work on, say, a poetry collection and then back to the novel. Sometimes that happens, but mostly I write in chunks. Like right now for the fall, I'm pretty much devoting it to trying to get this novel off the ground. Earlier, I devoted the summer, though, to trying to pull this poetry collection together, and that's pretty much all I did. So that's how I tend to do it. I kind of go deep immersion, just because I'm just a kind of monofocal type of person, and I don't really do well. I'm not a good multitasker. When my daughter was a teenager and had music going on and a video and this and that and doing her homework, and she would ask me to come in to help with an essay, I'm like, turn everything off, and then I would put earplugs and she'd look at me like I'm some flotsam from the 19th century, but really it's true. I just can only focus on one thing at a time. Even just trying to talk to all of you at once is hard. Okay, so we'll keep rotating.
It's interesting. I was wondering, when you're writing a novel, do you write it in a linear fashion, or do you write scenes or chapters based on something that's happening within you in terms of where your focus is?
Yeah, I would say linear is probably the furthest thing from what I do, especially in early drafts. Later you have to bring in the more critical faculties to organize the mess. But initially I try and keep it as open as possible to randomness. I try and invite mystery into the work, chaos, things I only dimly perceive, and really get at that quote from Grace Paley, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, which is about write about what you don't know about what you know. It's one of my favorite things. And so sort of get below the topography of what I think I'm working on and start just sending taproots into places. And that's where poetry is so helpful, because it tends to flush out what you don't even know you're really preoccupied with, sort of the agenda below the agenda below the agenda. So my first drafts I would not want to inflict on anyone. They're very messy. That's why I just, when I do a creative writing workshop and people are bringing work in progress, I have just the utmost respect. Yes. Because I, at this point, would not do that, and would not inflict that upon people, and then it really takes me, well into the second or third draft before things start resembling a narrative that I can begin to work with, begin to make sense of, that might make sense to others. But that's how it is for me. It's just a messy process.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that is hard to sometimes convey to our students is how messy it is.
Yeah.
Because we want it to be, students want it to be neat, and I think to a certain degree you have to be kind of comfortable with the unknown, with the mystery of the process, and be willing to be in that intuitive process.
Well, because throughout school it's always outline, so everything has to be structured. So
right.
I mean, for me, I'm terrible with outlines, so I just start writing. But the difficult part is keeping on track.
Yes, yes.
So, like, do you have, like, how do you keep yourself on track and with the story instead of...
Yeah, I don't really try and keep on track so much. What I try and do is get a certain amount done a day. I mean, and it may go way off track, or it may seem on the surface like a big detour, and maybe after a few days or months or whatever, I will end up excising it. But if I start thinking about efficiency, I might as well just jump off a cliff, because really, I mean, this is not an accounting ledger we're talking about here. This is a novel, and it's and like I said earlier, I think it was Henry James who spoke disparagingly of Tolstoy's novels as big shaggy monsters, right? So I think you have to welcome the big shaggy monster and not worry so much early on. And what you were saying, I completely related to earlier, because that always is a problem with my students as well, because they're used to reading great literature all the time, and so they see their first, second draft scribblings, and they get so dispirited, and they think, oh, I can't do it, and they don't have the confidence yet to trust that process, to know that sensibility, their sensibilities bearing down again and again on work will refine it, will, at one point it will begin to soar, but they don't have that patience yet, or the trust. I mean, none of us did initially.
Yes, this is true.
Yeah. So I try and remind them of that. And,
You talked earlier about language when you were talking about poetry, and one of the things when the three of us got together to discuss your work, one of the things that we talked about was about language, and about how you talk about language even in your narrative, and we wondered about your thoughts about how you use language to create character. And I think, Susan, there was a specific line in Dreaming in Cuba that I think we talked about, the way in which language is used to define who we are, right? And I think there was a line and I can't quite remember it at this moment, but you were describing the difference between the grandmother and the granddaughter, and how she lost the island in her speech. I think I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah, no, it was like that.
Yeah.
And where the granddaughter was in her journey between real places and mythical places, and how language helps create that myth. Is that what we were?
Mythical home.
We were talking. One of the things that we talked about was how language defines who we are and how we see the world, and the way in which you use that to define your character, and how do you, are you consciously thinking about that when you're creating your characters?
yeah, I think so. I'm trying to remember. I think it was James Baldwin who said that language is the key to identity. So what people say, how they say it, when they say it, tells you everything about who they are. And I'm probably badly paraphrasing as well there, but I think it's true, and I think it's especially true in Dreaming in Cuba, and since we're mainly talking about that today, that there are almost kind of linguistic constellations around each character. They each have a vernacular vocabulary that they go back to again and again, which I think is reflective of their varying worldviews, and their relationships with each other, as well as their complicated relationships to Cuba and the revolution and so on. But I think also it's used, for example, I think there's a connection, say, between some of the lyricism and madness in the book. I mean, Felicia is never more poetic than when she's, in that summer of coconuts, when she's kind of losing her mind, right? Yeah. Or Celia's letters, that private diary, or the kind of chronicling of her private life, and its woes. So I think not so much early on that I'm so conscious of it, but later on, when I have a little bit more critical distance on it, I can start massaging and finessing some of that. But much of it happens organically, you know, as I'm sure you know in your own work, that characters start taking shape and
and they start to speak in a certain way.
Yeah, they start to speak in a certain
specific,
way, and you feel after a while that there's a point where, for me anyway, where I feel like I'm in their bloodstream, and that takes, you know, different times, amount of time and effort, depending on the character. I seem to be able to do crazy Cuban women fairly easily, but others, you know, like my Chinese guy in monkey hunting, I mean, that took, I would say, 5 years before I felt I could convincingly go anywhere with him and I would know what he would do. So it just kind of depends, and some characters come harder than others, and but I do think there is a, you know, this linguistic constellation around characters, and that language does reflect identity in both surface and profound ways. Yeah.
One of the things that I think the three of us began to talk about also in that same kind of context was about the way in which I think we wrote the idea that language has this potential to exile us. I think that was one of the things, and we noticed. We wanted to ask you, how do you use language to talk about the experience of being in exile?
That's such an interesting question. Well, in the session just before here, when I was talking to some of your students, this whole issue came up of living on the hyphen, which is a phrase by Gustavo Pérez Figmach, another Cuban writer, poet, academic, and this notion of being between cultures, sometimes two, sometimes more cultures, where you're navigating and negotiating those boundaries constantly, which are not fixed boundaries, and they're not like what they're trying to do on the Mexican-U.S. border boundaries. You know, they're smoky, perforated sorts of boundaries, which you are traversing constantly, often, you know, many times during the course of a day. And so we talked a little bit about how sometimes you have 1 foot in one, or both feet in one, or half a foot in the other, or toe here. And so that these kinds of navigations, these kinds of vacillations between languages, between cultures, I think are very enriching for both or more. You know, I think it's a privilege in a way to, and sometimes it doesn't necessarily have to be different languages. You know, it could be different cultures, different ethnic cultures, different. So I think, as I was trying to say before, I think the language is a reflection of identity, and in terms of the exile situation, how much Spanish you speak, from what era, kind of the mix of English that you use, all defines in a way how close you are to Miami, Havana, the revolution, and so on. So, I mean, I could talk to someone for 5 minutes, another Cuban, and pretty much figure out their politics, everything, just from these code words that happens, a special kind of code switching that happens, and this kind. You know, I'm saying this in the exile context, but we do this all the time in all sorts of contexts. But in the exile context, you really pretty quickly get to know who you're dealing with, you know, and you kind of circle each other for a while until you're like, okay, can we talk, or are you gonna is this gonna end up on the radio and you know, my being publicly excoriated? So I think it's very pronounced, not only just in the exile, but with immigrants as well. You know, how far away you are from that initial dislocation, that rupture, and how downwind are you from that, and how traumatic was that, say, for my parents, and my living in the wake of that trauma and dislocation. How has that affected me? What have I absorbed that I haven't even realized, you know, till much later? How does it infiltrate, saturate one's language in conscious and unconscious ways? I think that's an ongoing process too, because language is a living thing.
Very organic.
I'll tell you quickly a very funny story. When I first went back to Cuba in 1983, and I opened my mouth to start speaking, everyone's jaw dropped, and they called in all the neighbors to hear me speak Spanish, because my Spanish was kind of flash frozen in the 1950s. The language in Cuba had continued on and evolved, and it had all these things, and I was like the equivalent of talking like some hipster 50s, Allen Ginsberg type of thing, because I was speaking my parents' language that had also been flash frozen. They hadn't been in Miami, where things also were evolving. They were just by themselves in New York, and we weren't part of another community. So I was like some flash from the past, and everyone found it hilarious and made fun of me mercilessly. In good fun, made fun, but that also spoke to my alienation on a language level. Yeah,
it's an interesting journey in America. The idea of the hyphenated American. And you mentioned the sort of the exile within the country. And so that's an interesting area to kind of think about and talk about a little bit too, that sense of, so this is the identity that you have now because of place. And so are there ways that you experience also exile from original place in America?
Yes,
Because
absolutely.
you've lived in a lot of different places.
I've lived in a lot of different places. I would say that that feeling of exile within an exile hit most home in Miami in the 80s. I lived in Miami from 87 to 88 as a journalist. Went to Miami and thinking that it might be something of a homecoming. Finally, I'll be with Cuban Americans. I'll get to see what's going on. And I never felt so alienated in a place as I did in Miami in the late 80s. And I was just a garden variety Democrat. And boy, you would have thought I was like a secret agent from Castro's communist regime. I couldn't say anything bad about Reagan, and that was really hard, and did not succeed. And so it was just kind of a misery there. And I thought, wow, I really don't belong here. And yet, but I was just getting, again, the surface. There's a lot that goes below the surface, and there are a lot of people who are, who have more complicated relationships to the island, to politics and whatever, but you don't hear from them because there's such a stranglehold on public discourse, both on the Cuban side, on the other side of the Straits of Florida, as well as in Miami. And that shouting match of 50 plus years, I have found not productive whatsoever, and they're really, as far as I'm concerned, the flip sides of each other. And it does not get into all of the complexities of the real situation, the way real people are living and managing families divided by the Cuban Revolution, generational issues, language complexity. None of that is addressed with that shouting match. And so I feel like, in part, I kind of dedicated my life to just complicating that picture of sotto voce as it feels sometimes, just trying to dispel that hostage situation that occurs there. I have a new book coming out in May called King of Cuba, which I think deals directly with that. And on the one hand, I have channeled Fidel Castro as El Comandante. I had an obscenely fun time writing him. I don't know why. Maybe, like I said, there's a flip side. And then on the other side, I have this kind of crazy Miami Cuban exile who's waiting for the son of a bitch to die, And so it's the two of them plus a rabble of Cuban voices who are contesting and fighting and skewering these official versions all the time. And so I think, I don't know, I feel like I'm the one with the skewer.
Yes. That's the beauty of being an author, right?
Yeah,
A fiction writer, that you get to play with these different ideas and you get to shape them in a different way.
Yeah.
And
not with these received histories.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, go ahead. Do you want to?
No.
I was actually, that actually kind of takes me back to Susan's initial questions about mythic homes and like real homes. I think that sometimes, and I think it's interesting because I think all the women on the panel are kind of like hyphenated people, right? In some way, right? Yes. And I think that we all have some kind of mythic ideas of home in our personal histories, right? My grandparents being from the South, and then I'm further exiled because I'm from St. Louis, but I'm in California now, and you know, and I think it's a lot of African Americans are in similar states. And we live in a community with a lot of immigrants, and our students, we have a lot of students who are immigrants from various places all over the globe, and so the idea of what that home is like, what home is, becomes almost mythologized in our view, and it's further complicated by reality. Sometimes we try to go back to that home, or we try to recreate that home in some way or another, and it almost never lives up to our expectations. And I wanted to talk about that as an idea that seems, at least to seem to permeate the idea of dreaming in Cuba. And could you talk a little bit about the mythic home and the idea of what it should be, and how we deal with our ideas about that?
Yeah, no, that is an interesting conundrum, I think. I don't know. In Dreaming in Cuban, I think for Pilar, who's a little bit of my alter ego in the book, I think Cuba is a sort of mythical place, a place that has been jealously distorted in a way by both sides, although she doesn't know that. She just sees the mother's side until she goes back to Cuba. And I think for just myriad reasons, geopolitical and otherwise, I think Cuba has always gotten kind of more like a very disproportionate share of the world's attention. I mean, for one little island, think about it.
Yeah.
I don't know whether we're just this loudmouth clan or what, but we just don't shut up, and we're always in the news. But I think on the exile side, I think home has become more myth than reality. There's this joke that was going around a few years ago. That it went something like this: if every Cuban American who had a deed to his ranch in Cuba actually produced it, Cuba would be the size of Brazil. Okay, so I think that kind of sums it up. That it just and it also reminds me of that wonderful short story collection by Ana Menendez, also a Cuban American writer, and the title is "In Cuba, I Was a German Shepherd." This is a Chihuahua talking, okay? So there is just this sense that things get really blown out of proportion. It was never hot there, no humidity, no, the sea breezes were always blowing, no racial tension, nothing. And then it becomes this this land that just can't exist. But memory does funny things, and the hardships of learning a new language, landing in a new place, all of that lends itself to that kind of nostalgia. And not only that, but since most of the Cubans are right there in Miami or in the exteriors, you're only not even 200 miles away from the island. So a storm that cruises across Cuba 1 hour is hitting Miami the next. So you're breathing the same air. The flora, the fauna, everything is still close enough to keep this thing alive and growing increasingly out of control. So I think home is a mythic place at this point. Most people who I have heard many older Cubans say, I never want to go back because I want to remember it the way it was. But the way they remember it also probably bears very little resemblance to reality anymore either. Right. So what is home in all of this,
Exactly.
And I have moved around my whole adult life quite a bit, and so I don't really have any geographic sense of home. but I do have a sense of home largely being on the page for me. I always feel at home in writing mode. And I could be anywhere. I could be at a hotel in Santa Cruz like I was this morning, or traveling around Ecuador with my daughter, which I did this summer. And there's something about that ongoing conversation with authors, kind of the deep immersion in a work in progress that feels like home to me. Geography no longer is that relevant. Although I think I'm a New Yorker, I go back, but I've lived more time in California than New York. So what does that mean? And when I got off the plane yesterday, I thought, back to California. That felt like home. So I think I'm just very chameleon-like and at this point. But the one reliable is home being on the page at this point.
And that's an interesting concept, that idea. Do you think that to a certain extent to be a really involved kind of writer in a way that you need to be willing to let go of attachment to place or attachment to ideas about how it ought to be or how a life should be, etc.?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't purport to prescribe that to anybody one way or another. I mean, I think it certainly works that way for me. I think I have fantasized about finding the perfect corner of the world, and I don't know, that perfect corner keeps changing. So I think I'm reasonably adaptable, although I did find a place that I could not live, which was Lubbock, Texas. Don't get me started. I can only quote that country song that says, "Happiness is Lubbock in my rearview mirror." So I'm not going back there. But aside from that, I am fairly adaptable. And I mean, I'm living outside of Austin right now, and have lived kind of all over. But I think other people, and I have writer friends for whom it's absolutely essential that they have that the place part of things is steady and predictable. So, and that steadiness and predictability enables them to take the flights of fantasy that they need to create. And they could no longer ride on the road or rove around the way I do and expect to write a book, then I would feel in one place for too long a time. So I think people need to find that for themselves, and that that could change over time as well. But how about for you? How do you feel about home and place, and how that informs your writing?
That's a good question. I think I'm like your writer friend. I definitely need one
room of your own.
A room of my own, some form of stability. But I think that it's interesting because I think my writing is obsessed with this idea that there is no stability, or that you can't get that necessarily from a single place.
Yes.
And there's a restlessness, I think, in my characters who are searching for that kind of stability, but it seems to elude them. That's what I would think. I think I'm saying this. I don't know.
How about you, Paulette?
Yes. My original home, of course, was Mississippi, right? And like you, I've traveled and lived in a lot of different places, and I still find that psychological home is Mississippi. So I find myself, in some instances, struggling in different kinds of ways because I experience what seems like an exile from place, and there are numerous reasons for this self-imposed exile. Yes. But the general idea is that as much as I write from different places, that I still find myself, my characters, the most in-depth kinds of characters, and the traits and qualities and all of that, and the subjects that I want to write about all come from that original place. And so, but because I'm away from there, home has to be here, and home has to be here. And so, and I think there are numerous ways that I carry that sort of mythic idea because I have this child's ideal of what Mississippi is, and then I have this adult's feeding into after life experience, away from there, and the objectivity of being able to look at it from here. And so those two things in my writing frequently clash. But there is this necessity simply to make sure that I've maintained the home inside, the Mississippi that, that I grew up in.
Yes.
So, and otherwise, I can write anywhere. Because I have some journalism background too, and so
always on
the
the move,
necessity,
right?
exactly.
To
So
just
you
do
learn how to shut out whatever if you need to in order to write. So.
And is this relevant to your work as well?
Yes, very, very much so. I was thinking about what Lenore was saying about, I've learned for me that the one thing I can count on in life is change, that things are impermanent and they change all the time. But I too have a mythic place, which, please don't laugh, it's Michigan.
We laughed.
We laughed anyway.
It's
Just
Michigan.
set us up.
It's Michigan. It's Lake Erie. It's it's the cabin we had, and it's my parents from Toledo, in particular my mother, who was herself an educator and did a very fine job with all three of her kids. But she had the task of building a blind daughter and building a daughter who could float her life, kind of anywhere. And there are ways in which I keep returning to mother patterns, mother smells, the place of that. I mean, I can still, right now, I was walking by the portables on campus where we have our disabled services program, and there's a smell that the portables have that's a little bit musty that immediately almost recreates the log cabin that we had. And instantly I'm home. I know where the spiders are, I know where the boats are, I know the pump that scares me half to death, the loud noises, and I know what it's like to navigate by bird sound instead of, because I don't know how to use a cane, and it's weird, And so there's a way that I go back to that place is always there, and it's gone, and it is not there anymore, and those time periods aren't there. It's the mythic home. But I like to use it, and I especially like to think about it when I'm writing about something current. So if I'm in a new place and I check into a hotel and I'm on a really high story, if there's a balcony, I like to go out because that's how I see all the sounds come up. And I find that I capture immediacy better if there's a part of me that's sort of in that other place. And sometimes it's easier to write about things that happened long, long ago.
It's fascinating how just all these clusters of sensory details as well.
Just come back. When we were talking, another question that came up, and it came out of the discussion we were just having about the mythic home, and it's the terrain of emotional autobiography. Students, I don't know if you have this with your own students, but often when we're teaching, students are, well, is this true? And they want to try to relate the story that they're reading to the writer's own life, own personal history, own physical history. And we were thinking, when we were talking, that there's a vulnerability involved in sharing that emotional autobiography, and that decisions have to be made, about how much we're willing to reveal and how much not. And we were wondering if those are, I suppose they're not conscious thought processes, but if those are things that you think about, and if you know how much when you're writing, how, my sense is that a lot of what's coming from you is more the emotional autobiography than other autobiography. And I just wondered about what that negotiation process is like.
Yeah, I would say definitely emotionally autobiographical. And Dreaming in Cuban, the first book, is probably the most saturated with my childhood and preoccupations of my family and the whole fallout from the Cuban Revolution and how it created this huge schism in both sides of the family, my father's side and my mother's side. But I do think there's something to be said, since, whether I'm writing about the 19th century Chinese farmer, or in my fourth novel, Handbook to Luck, I had a young woman Iranian woman who is a daughter of privilege. Her father was a physician to the Shah, or Salvadoran street vendor. I mean, there's something, even when you're writing far afield from your own specific experience, that I think still becomes a product of your sensibility and your obsessions and your pleasures and your concerns. And so I think to that extent, even though if it's not related strictly to autobiography, it's certainly related to the internal emotional terrain of one's autobiography. It's a chronicling of one's preoccupations, a chronicling of one's obsessions. I mean, I think in a way that's what novels are. You know, they reflect through character and story what we're desperately interested in. You know? So if that isn't emotionally autobiographical, I don't know what is, you know.
Where do you draw, like, the boundaries, like, giving out too much information? Because I know we're supposed to, like, good writing comes from experience, but sometimes you don't want to put too much of yourself into the character. So, like, how do you know when to stop?
Do you mean a specific autobiographical information that you could be called on by relatives later? Or do you mean?
I don't know. It's if you're creating a character and a lot of that character is based upon yourself, like, where do you stop? And, like, where do you stop and that character begins?
Yeah. I don't know if there is a kind of a line you cross at any particular time. I think, like we were talking about perforated smoky lines before, I think over the course of writing a character, I mean, the most probably emotionally autobiographical character is Pilar in Jamie and Cuban, who's, like as I mentioned, an alter ego. But there's a point in which Cristina is kind of left in the dust, you know, once this character takes off and starts, you know, behaving in ways that I only wish I could have, you know, behaved and talked back to my mother and done all this stuff that I really would have been slammed had I actually done it. So I think also I would say that to my students in workshop, which even if they're, you know, when they're writing fiction, which is mostly what I do, I would say don't worry. No one is looking over your shoulder right now. Write it as if no one you're worried about will read it. That's the only way you can free yourself. And then ironically, when you free yourself that way, you're also freeing up the character's own agency. You know, beyond what you are circumscribing or worried about with your own character. And sometimes very strange things happen. I mean, I was particularly worried, not really with the Pilar character, but with the Lourdes character, whose essence is very much my mother. And then toward the end, as I was getting in the last drafts, I was like, oh my gosh, she's going to read this thing. I'm going to have to move to Malaysia. You know, this is going to be bad. And so I started throwing all kinds of things at her. You know, I gave her this wandering eye. I gave her like orthopedic shoes, you know, unsightly uniform. And I'm thinking, I thought maybe if I could physically distance her from my own rather decorous mother, that it would work. And anyway, flash forward, the book comes out. A couple of months later, I get the dreaded call. And you know, it's my mother. Hey, Cristi, ¿cómo estás? I read your book. I'm like, oh, hi, Mom. You know, okay. And she says, I have just one thing to say to you. And I said, yeah. She goes, you know that Lourdes? The one that was... She goes, I think she was the heroine of the novel. Go figure, right? That was certainly not my intention, and she never once said, oh, you based her on me, or other people, you know, cousins, other people were like, oh my God, you did your mother, blah. But my mother, no, because it, in a weird way, it dovetailed with what she considered the best part of herself. It's not what I considered the best part of her, but you know, that somehow that I got this character right, you know, with her anti-communism and vowing to fight Castro with her crullers, you know, whatever, and pecan sticky buns, and you know that she really appreciated it, and then other people have come up and said that Lourdes is like my mother, you know, or whatever. So you really never know, and I don't think you should get in your own way. again, write as if nobody you're afraid of is going to read it.
Nobody's
Yeah, and then once you do it, it's impossible to scale it back. Then what are you gonna and dumb it down, make it less interesting? No, let it rip. Yeah.
Yes. And if all else fails when it's out there, you can always deny how close it is.
That's right. Deny. That's why all fiction has, any resemblance.
To person.
Yeah, and you know that's not true, but
Yeah.
protect yourself. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
And if it's you, you're not going to come after yourself with a lawsuit anyway. So.
Exactly.
Yeah, memoir. I don't know. I've never written memoir, but I did write a poetry book that was very, very autobiographical in terms of my brother, and was hoping nobody would find it. And then my sister found it like 2 years after it was published, and it was kind of tense. And the other day she said to me, I don't know, we were talking about something. She goes, well, I don't want to talk to you because you're just going to use it. I'm like, no. But I think sometimes people view writers as kind of predators, as if, but I don't think that's true. I mean, I think we own these histories as much as anyone else, and I think we're free to elaborate and I mean, what's fiction if not kind of gorgeous distortion? And that's what we distort and we emphasize, and sometimes that eclipses the reality of what actually happened. But even the reality is always in contest. I mean, I think that's why I was saying that's why I love multi-voice narratives, because no one narrator is holding all the cards. People are competing for history, big history, little histories. And I think that's absolutely essential and more authentic and truthful than that booming authorial omniscient voice. As much as I love those great Russian novels, I don't think I could write one.
It's why none of us have the same parents, because we have a very different history of how life happens. So we're free to write it.
Yes. Yeah.
That's so interesting, because I know that, and I wonder about the multi-generational aspect of your work. I was thinking about Paulette's work is also multi-generational. My work is also multi-generational, and I was wondering if that is somehow a product of our trying to make sense of these multiple histories. Personal histories and political histories. And I'm not really sure there's a question attached to this. It's just really an observation about the way in which we're trying to make sense of our parents' view of the world and the world that they lived in, and our view of the world and the world that we now lived in, kind of being this kind of second. A second generation. I'm not sure if that's the right term, but we certainly are removed from our parents' experience as they are from their mythical homes, and we're removed from theirs, and it becomes very interesting.
I think their stories, our grandparents' stories, our grandparents' they're all our inheritance. It's our legacy to sort out and fight against, navigate, absorb, parse, etc. So I think it makes a lot of sense that we're all obsessed with this, because it's inheritance.
Right.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you this one question: as a writer of color, do you get saddled with the mantle of kind of representing your culture, and how do you feel about that?
It happens. It can be frustrating sometimes, but I also get the reverse, because I write in English, because I didn't grow up in Miami, because I am, may I repeat, a garden variety Democrat, etc. I really don't you know, I'm not exactly a poster girl for the Cuban exile at all, and often we'll get into public disagreements. I swear, I think there was some woman following me around from reading to reading, or some version of her. She just like would resurface kind of in the same little suit. It wasn't the same woman, but it was like, I felt like it was some emissary from my mother's generation who was saying, well, you know, really, Cuban daughters don't talk to their mothers like that. You know, or why are you, you know, the effect of why are you airing our dirty laundry? That what you are doing is betrayal, not portraiture. And that would just get a rise out of me every time, you know, because sometimes, you know, in certain communities, you're expected to be, what do they call that? Like when you're trying to promote a city or like the
a spokesperson.
Yeah, like a spokesperson, but also
Emissary of sorts.
yeah. But these actually exist, like a public relations arm of, say, Miami. It's like the tourism bureau or something. You know, you're supposed to always show things in the best light, and there's a tremendous amount of pressure on that. And I think we as writers, poets, novelists, memoirists, or whatever, we don't do that, and so we're not exactly popular sometimes with our own kin, as much as we are with others who are curious, say, about kind of the inner workings of the Cuban exile or what's happening on the island. The Cubans themselves are often the least happy with, you know, what I write. So yes, I get pressures. Less now, but especially in the early years with Jimmy and Cuban and the Agüero Sisters, pressures to do a very kind of sanitized, idealized version, basically to buy into the whole nostalgia myth about who we are and why we're here, and we're not immigrants, we're exiles, blah blah blah, you know, and I just was constantly feeling like I was trying to break off this straight jacket. So I don't feel that so much anymore. I've got more far field. I think people lose interest. You know, they moved on. You know, like, what can you say? I guess it's a mixed blessing. But I don't know what happened to that woman who was following me around from reading to reading. She's gone. You know. So if that's any indication.
Yes. Well, a question from my students was kind of related to that, actually, where they, some of them had looked at the YA book, the young adults novel, with the 3 different main characters who are from very different cultural backgrounds. And the question that they had was, what was the interest there? So I think one was a German Canadian, and the other, one of the characters was from India,
German Canadian. Another one was from Iran.
And
then the other was a Cuban Jewish girl, Miami, New York. I was very interested in putting these different cultures together in a kind of pressure cooker situation, and so that's why I set them in this boarding school in the 70s in Switzerland. Yes. And not that I'm an expert on that, believe me, but it was kind of fun to play around with that and just all of that excess and possibility. Not my usual terrain.
Yes.
Yeah.
My students were very interested in that, having looked at the other material, the primary material. And then this newest, well, not the newest, but a Significant Girls, I think was the title of it.
Yeah, the young adult book.
Yes, and so they were interested both in what shifted you from thinking about, to write a young adult's novel, and then again, like why the specifics of those 3 cultural groups.
Well, Iranians I've been very interested in, having spent so much time in Los Angeles. I wrote extensively about an Iranian character in Handbook to Luck. It's a culture that has many analogous dysfunctions, you know, with the Cubans. And one of my best friends actually lived in LA for many years. She's Iranian and is now back in Tehran for some time. Her husband is one of the bigwigs in the nuclear program that everyone is so worried about. And so I think I just have a particular interest, you know, that Iran also had a revolution. And part of what I was interested in is what led up to that 1979 revolution. And so when we see the excess and the of this particular, she was a princess, Iranian princess in the story, we can well imagine why there was this big upheaval in 79, why it went to such another extreme. There's politics involved in everything I do. In terms of the German Canadian, she was the daughter of, her dad was an SS officer in World War II, and went through so much during the war that he decided to get as far away from it as possible and ended up in very rural Canada. And then there's the Cuban Jewish girl whose father, unlike the other Miami exiles, was actually very pro-dialogue and who was ostracized for it and had to decamp from Miami to New York. And so all in their ways, all of them in their ways are living in kind of ruptured and ruptured times and under the pressure of much upheaval, personally and politically. And so that's really, I mean, yeah, the setting is kind of this glamorous, semi-glamorous, not so glamorous, but, you know, this place. But really what they're dealing with are, you know, kind of their personal issues and issues of friendship and allegiance, and which are, you know, issues many teenagers are dealing with. Yeah.
So, speaking about the young adult book, how you write in multiple genres, right? How do you shift gears? I wanted to talk to you about you know, writing for an adult audience and then writing for a young adult audience. How do you shift gears, and how do you think? How does it your thinking about audience change the way you write or affect the way you write? Are you thinking when you're beginning to write that I'm going to write for this audience, or does it come about in some other organic way?
No. The three books I've written for young readers were all very specifically for young readers, and in each one I imagine my daughter as the recipient. She's now 20, so I don't think, I mean, that's it. I probably will not write anything else. But the picture book, The Dog Who Loved the Moon, was a book that I wrote for her as a Christmas present that I hoped would be in lieu of actually getting a real dog. It didn't work. I had to get the real dog anyway. So that was that. And then I Want to Be Your Shoebox was when she was in middle school and her grandfather died, a very beloved grandfather died. And so it was a way of dealing with that. And she's in conversation with this, her Russian Jewish grandfather a lot in that. And she actually helped me write that book in the sense that I would show her the pages every day, and she would catch me on an alarming number of infelicities. No one talks like that, Mom, or, you know, just many rolls of the eyes. And but also, I think it was a helpful process, you know, in her grieving for her grandfather and kind of my understanding what she was going through, and then there was always the question, where are the boys? Where are the boys? I'm like, what? Well, boys? And you're only in middle school. And then the other one was also, you know, for her as well. So, I mean, I think I'm probably done with the kids' books. Yeah. So.
How do you get out of writer's block?
Are you suffering from writer's block?
Sometimes.
Let's talk about you.
Well, it's for me, it's more difficult to keep on track with something because I tend to lose interest in something and then I'll start on something else and then it just keeps going back and forth. But sometimes it's like I end up writing myself into a corner, and it's difficult to get out. So I was wondering if you had any like techniques that you use, or because I know you mentioned poetry at the beginning to get yourself started, but what do you do once you've started and you've written yourself into a corner?
The poetry works no matter where you're at in your process, because let's say if you're stuck in that corner, if you, again, inviting the randomness in through poetry, through conversations with other writers, through reading their work, you will invariably get ideas for what you want to do. And I also think, going back to what you say, you lose interest or whatever. I think you have no obligation to finish something that you're not interested in. You know, I think you should be I mean, I don't want to let you off the hook here. Sorry, guys. But I mean, just write what absolutely compels you, what you're obsessed by, and then no matter what, the thing is going to be alive. If you're desperately interested in something, we will be too. Yeah. If you're just going through the paces, you know, we're not going to want to read that.
I think that what's interesting for students, or challenging for some students, particularly when they're in the introductory, fiction courses or creative writing courses, is you get these prompts, and they seem, and they're supposed to be broad, and and the purpose of them being broad is so you can figure out how to get your work with your obsessions. But I think that students sometimes have a more challenging time figuring out how to make the prompt work for whatever it is.
Yeah, or incorporate with work in progress. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And I think that
some
that
practice.
Can, it takes some practice. But I do think that having a psychological white space, I guess you would call it, where you're not thinking too much, will allow you to make the associations that you never would have thought of if you're kind of approaching it in a more linear, conscious fashion. I was just thinking of a specific time when I was at a workshop and I was given this prompt. What was the prompt? I had to repeat a word through, and this is the assignment that I've given you guys online, that you have to repeat this word throughout the piece, and you just have to choose a word. And I thought, well, that's great. What the hell am I going to do with that, right? And it's like, because I'm thinking, I have this novel I want to write, and I have this, these ideas of, about the novel that I want to, kind of incorporate, and that's what I came here for, and how I'm going to repeat a word. And I ended up spending a lot of time on my iPod listening to the blues, and I specifically chose to listen to music that was about train travel, because I was writing, because the novel that I'm writing is about Pullman porters. And so, and I talked to my students about this, and I started thinking about, hold on to your ticket, and, hold on to your baggage, and just all of the things that people, have to hold on to when they're traveling, right? And then that became a whole metaphor for other things that people are holding on to when they travel from place to place. And that became the word that got repeated over and over again in this kind of like little writing piece. Yeah. But I don't think I would have gotten there if I hadn't been listening to the music and allowed myself to kind of be in the corner for a while. Yes. You know what I mean? Sometimes you have to sit in the corner. Yes.
Time out.
Yeah, just be on your time out and work your way out of it. And not like push your way out of it, but kind of, allow yourself to have that white space where, where the ideas like actually seek you out rather than you seeking them, I think.
Yeah, I think that's the hard part, because majority of the time you get stuck and you're like, what am I going to do?
And I know you guys feel like you have a terrible deadline, but imagine I was at this workshop and I had to actually have that piece ready for the next morning. So like 8 o'clock the next morning we were sitting down to workshops. We had to have everything like printed out, So it'll happen. It just might happen at 2 a.m., but it'll happen. So are there any other questions from the panel?
Well, I had actually a question from a student, because we did the online looking at who you are. And so, in looking at some of your bio information, they noted that you were working at Time magazine when you decided to dedicate totally to creative writing. And so the question that the students had was, so why were you willing to let go of this? And the word they used was prestigious job for this prestigious magazine. It's the kind of thing that in America we seek, right? And so what was it that made it, that was compelling you or whatever to take that kind of risk, to let go of something that you had that was solid and clear with regards to career and et cetera, and to take a risk on something that was not, at the time, you couldn't be clear that it was going to hold you up in the same way that a position at Time magazine would.
Yeah. Well, I had taken a leave of absence at one point toward the end of my tenure at Time for about 5 months. I had saved up money, and that's, I just wrote furiously during that time, and big bulk of Dreaming in Cuban was written and refined in just that crazy period. And then when I went back to Time after that, that's just pure misery set in. And I thought, I don't really have a choice here. I can't go back to this. And so I just saved up some more money and was able to combine that with a fellowship I got, and it just gave me just enough time to finish the book and then get launched that way.
Very good.
Yeah. Yeah. But,
yes, because I think that for a lot of our students, and even for myself at the early stages of my career, it's difficult to take the risk. It's difficult to see how can I do this creative thing, even though there's a way that I'm being driven to do this creative thing, and how can I step away from the pieces that would ordinarily, that everyone tells you, you get the solid job and you plop down and you do the work of that, etc. And so what we're always trying to do with our students is to encourage them, if this is really where your heart is, to start now, not spend your time doing something else and then 10 years down the road or 15 years down the road, because it sets you back. And so the idea is to try and find ways that that make it possible, really, to have the courage in a way to even think about doing something like that. So to understand from, a writer who made the leap, who has done quite well as a consequence, and then how, what was the stuff, where do you find within yourself the courage to do that, to risk.
yeah.
So, and one of the other questions that sort of follows along from that in a way was how, publishing. What kind of advice would you give to students now who are thinking about publishing or trying to, given that there's so many ways now for publication to happen? And so would you value or talk about electronic publication or just print or, et cetera?
I'm fairly, I'm coming around to the electronic world, I guess. I think it kind of is the future. But the publishing industry is in such a state of flux right now that I'm actually not even sure what to say. Are publishers, the ones who, traditional publishers, even necessary anymore? I think they're asking themselves that question. Our books
just announced that they're not going to have a print version any longer.
Isn't that incredible? Yeah, this is what I'm talking about. Are three-dimensional books going to be like art objects now that only collectors gather and keep specialized libraries in? I don't know where all this will lead. I was always I hadn't downloaded a book ever until about a week ago. So, I'm always late to the party. And but someone had said, oh, you haven't read Clarissa, which is an 18,000-page 18th century novel, which I've never read. And so I went online, because I'm in kind of a remote little town in Texas. And I could have bought it for, I don't know, $20 or whatever. But then then I also saw that it was public domain and I could just download it immediately for free. And I thought, big breath, and I did it. And you don't know.
Yes.
I mean, if I'm doing it, then, and I had vowed, I love the smell of the paper. I mean, you should have heard me. But now, I mean, for $20 I sold out for the Clarissa. I mean, just think about that. That's just pathetic. But I think for me personally, I will always be, probably buying the books, and it still is for me a very sensory, necessary experience. And I love, I read with a pencil in my hand, and I'm always in conversation. So I don't really know. I mean, I think they might know more about what's going on or what the possibilities are. I know a lot of people are self-publishing. People are going straight to Amazon or other venues, and that that the middleman is going to be increasingly a kind of rarefied presence. I think over time. I mean, I don't think it's going to happen overnight, but it's already happening faster than I could have ever anticipated. So I don't know what it will look like in 10 years or 20 years.
Kind of scary.
And we'll probably still have books, and it's just something about being able
The
to
tactile experience.
flip through the pages and who knows.
Well, I'd like to ask our faculty if they have any last questions they'd like to ask our guest, Cristina Garcia. Anything else for follow-up?
If there's one thing you could, like one piece of advice you could give to starting writers, what would it be?
Oh, I don't think it's a very exciting advice, but but it's I guess the advice, and if I would give any at all, would be just to be a passionate reader, and that if you're a lifelong passionate reader, that will always fuel your writing, and even if the writing doesn't work out, the wonderful adventure of being a passionate reader is something you could have every single day of your life. So it's kind of a no-lose proposition.
Well, I'm hoping that after viewing this interview, we'll have a few more poetry books flying off the shelves as a result of you inspiring people to read poetry. That would be
thank
really
you.
great.
You were all wonderful. I appreciate your interest, and I'm so glad to be here. And going to post this on Facebook, or what are we going to be? Are we going to be friends on Facebook now?
It's definitely going to be available to our students, and I think iTunes University, is that correct? So we'll be out there in the cyberspace universe.
Okay, great. All right. Does this go onto YouTube and stuff as well, or is this more of a
Oh.
Let it go.
Set it free.
Set it free.
Set it free. Set it free.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
For sitting down and
very
talking
much.
with us, and
really
thank
my
you for
pleasure.
coming
Thanks
to
for being a
campus,
part of it,
for being a part of this
It was worth
discussion.
it. It was worth it.
And thank you to my colleagues, and thank you to our video and staff.
Tech support,
Thank you so much.
Have we said thank you to Zeus, who's been a model of canine civility here
Yes,
as well?
that's true.
Dream while you were
I could
I heard this, and I thought, okay, if it gets louder, I'm going to be reaching the hand. The Twitch thing.
Yeah.
Yes,
Zeus was
thank you,
wonderful.
Zeus. Yes.
So, thank
All
you.
right, thanks.
All right, and we'll see you all again, I hope.